Hi, everyone. This week I'll be adding to your discussions around disaster management and how social workers can influence or contribute to that process. I'm going to ask you though, is a disaster different from a crisis? So, your literature talked about different kinds of disaster, and you brought in different kinds of disaster as examples. So, is a disaster different from a crisis? And if it is, in what way? And the reason I ask this question is because normally we see a disaster as something that has happened in the immediate. So it just happened. A ship sunk. A bus crashed with students or people. Um, we have an ice storm, for example, where, people's properties got destroyed and lights were out for a long time, or a hurricane. We see those as disasters. In your discussions, you're talking about the crisis of the opioid addictions across Canada. And I want to compliment you on how you handle this discussion. I appreciated how you challenged each other, how you are actually acknowledging your privilege, and how your lived experiences influence how you think about what is a disaster and what is a crisis. But I'm also impressed with how you are considering or talking about considering turning the corner around rethinking some of those things that you already know. This is pretty exciting. It's really exciting to be a part of this process, and I thank you for being so honest with each other and actually allowing me in as well. But I want to pick up on what you said about this opioid crisis. One of you talked about how people in Vancouver on the east side have been dying from addictions for a long time, and we didn't seem to matter. Nobody identified that as a crisis until young white people, white men in particular, started dying rapidly from opioid overdose. And so the country galvanized around this disaster or crisis. But it's also interesting because Black people have been criminalized with the whole notion of the war on drugs, and they still are, with that same notion. So it's interesting how, as you identified, different bodies are treated differently, even when they're experiencing a similar kind of crisis. Isn't that interesting how that works? I find that interesting because the politicians, most of whom are white men and to a lesser extent white women, who appear to be cisgen, able-bodied, or people without disabilities within a certain age range, they're really talking about this opioid crisis. You also see mothers on your televisions crying and talking about the deaths of their children. So this whole opioid crisis that has gripped the Canadian nation state now has a humanistic perspective. It has human faces. We are allowed to climb into the lives of the people that are dying or the people that are in crisis, their families, to see their backgrounds, where they come from. And we see the discourse about them being good people, and as one of you said, deserving people. They've only lost their way a little bit, and it's not their fault. Whereas with other groups of people, it's their fault. We have a deficit model and a blame model where it's because of their inferiority why they're having social difficulties. So we clearly understand how that works. But I also want to ask you, why do we not see communities that do not have drinking water as a crisis and a disaster? Is it because we have accepted that this is a normal thing for these different communities, including Aboriginal communities and some communities in different parts of Canada, in rural and remote areas in the country? I know that when I was on Fogo Island a year ago, there was a boil water advisory, and it seems as if I didn't take it seriously enough, or I didn't boil my water properly enough, and I got ill during my stay, and it continued after I left. So why do we not see these things as crises? And why do we not see them as disasters? Or do we see them as one but not the other? Because we generally see disasters as something that happen, as I said, like ice storms or shipwrecks or bus crashes and things like that. But why do we not see the lack of drinking water as a disaster and a crisis? I want you to think about that, because you started hitting on this when you talked about the roads in Labrador, that one of them that was recently washed out with the rains, and what some of the neighboring community roads look like. And if you remember, a lot of areas in Labrador are not driving vehicles, they're using snowmobiles and those kinds of transportation to get around because of the snow and ice, right? But do we groom these trails? Or could they be groomed? Or do people need different kinds of modes of transportation? Do they need improved or better transportation to be able to move from communities to communities? And if they don't, is this considered a disaster or a crisis? And if it isn't, why not? Because the inability or lack of ability to safely transport yourself is a crisis, isn't it? Or is it not? Does it depend on who you are and your location? Question mark. Question mark, question mark, question mark. Lots of question marks. So that's just my thoughts on this whole notion of disaster and crisis. The final thing I want to say, though, is how can social workers contribute to disaster management? And I agree with what you've said before, is that we actually need to go into these communities and listen to what the people are saying, because they live there, they know what their needs are, they know what they needed before the disaster, and they know what they need now that there's a disaster. So we actually need to take a position of being there to help and support and contribute. And I know the term help is contested, because what does help mean? Because the social work profession has a history of assuming a helpful position, and we know what that has meant to some groups of people historically and present day. So I'm not talking about going in to rescue anyone, talking about helping or to exclude them with our helping hats on, but rather working collaboratively and in partnership with people in situations where we are not benefiting because sometimes what happens is that we go in with the intentions of helping, but what happens is we are benefiting more from highlighting what we're doing by tweeting or having newspaper or news, not just newspaper, but news come to talk to us about the things that we're doing and basically glorifying how we're contributing rather than talking to the people that are most affected and highlighting their needs and highlighting their positions in the current crisis that they're experiencing. So those are some of the things to look for when we go into communities saying that we're helping. And not taking a leadership role does not mean you're still not leading. There's a distinction here. So as social workers, we may go in and say, nope, we're not taking a leadership role. We're here to help you. But in fact, people are looking to us for some help. And rather than building capacity with the community, we actually begin to do the directing and the organizing. And so we are leading, even though it might look like we're not. And we might say that we're not. But so we need to really be careful of these kinds of things that creep into our relationships and how we work with communities during situations of crisis and or disasters. That's it.